So I'm going to start with my first question. Did you realize at the time how dramatic your decision was to leave everything behind and launch yourself and your children into an unknown world?
Okay. The short answer is absolutely not. Because we were inexperienced, we had no world experience whatsoever. We had traveled to go camping in the park not far away, and we didn't really know much about anything. But I think that what happened is that at 37 years old, I was still full of idealism, and my basic philosophy, and it still is that way perfectly, is that if you put the right ingredients in, you'll get the right results. And the way I was looking at us as a family is that we had a strong family unit, and we had two parents who were educated and intelligent. And I figured, what can go wrong with that?
So you had all the right ingredients.
No matter what we face, we're ready for it. Well, as ready as anyone can be.
Okay. And during your travels, did you experience any regrets for having made the decision to what you did? To do what you
Okay,
did?
that's interesting because looking at it objectively, you could say, oh, you must have regretted it there or there or there. You know, there are many places where things weren't going too well. I had to say there were only 2 points in the first couple of days where I had a glimmer of doubt. Like, I didn't really regret it, but when we took off in the big jumbo plane from New York airport, and I looked around and I saw where we were, who we were, and where we were going, I said, holy jeepers, did we make the right decision? So there was a glimmer of doubt at that point. Didn't last long because we fell asleep. And then once we landed in London and went to that little hotel called the Jesmond Dean, and we saw how bad this place was. Like, it was the worst place that I'd ever seen. And this was a hotel, and we were going to be doing that more. I had my second glimmer of hope at that point. Not of hope, of doubt. Second glimmer of doubt. But after that, it was business. Let's do it, and let's have fun, and let's experience life.
And please describe which part of the trip caused you the most trouble and why.
Okay, well, that's very easy to do. Our second week in Russia. We were in Russia for 2 weeks. The first week was magnificent because we were in Leningrad, and we went to the Hermitage Museum, and we saw the Winter Palace, and we saw the canals and the city and all that. And it was absolutely perfect. But then in the second week, we took off and went towards Moscow, and this is where the big accident happened. And that had to be the worst time of the whole year that we were away. The accident itself, which caused quite a bit of damage to our home, our camper van. How we were received by the military police, how we were considered suspect, how the camper van wouldn't start, and how I had to get under in the mud in the dark and restart the thing. That whole period, I sort of put in parentheses because it was really, really a bad time.
And what about for the interrogation? How did you feel for that?
The interrogation? You mean at the police station?
Yeah.
Oh, that was weird because I assumed, being in Russia and seeing the way the military were acting, I assumed that something wrong was going to happen, something really wrong. And of course I had stories in my mind of all the things that people have written about the bad Russia and communism and all that. And when I was taken by a policeman to a little town nearby, and brought to an infirmary, I said, holy jeez, I'm done for. They're gonna inject me with something, they're gonna accuse me of something, and I'm gonna have to confess, and the worst scenarios were going through my mind. Turned out not to be too bad because they just wanted a breathalyzer test, which is normal here, but the circumstances weren't good.
Now, at the other end of the spectrum, would you describe which part of the trip caused you the most joy and why?
Okay. In a sense, there were many joyous occasions because it seemed that whenever there was a down, we would rebound and there'd be a way up right after. And for instance, the incident in Russia, which was very bad, was followed by 1 week camping in the woods in Luxembourg, and it was perfect. It was a beautiful environment. We walked in the woods and we came back to humanity, it seemed. And then right after, we spent a month in Paris, which was absolutely gorgeous and beautiful. So that, there was a low down and it was followed by a high. So joy there. Then after the other accident near the Spanish border, we went to a beach in Tarragona and we were there for a week and it was a beautiful beach. And right after, or soon after, we were in Greece for a whole month, which was beautiful because we had our house and everything. So that was bad followed by joy. But you're asking me my most joyful? Most joyful. Well, as you know, when we landed in Australia, it was a bit of a downer because what we were expecting to happen when we got there didn't happen. But right after, we were picked up by the family, the Australian family called the Taylors, and we spent nearly a month at their ranch. You can imagine a sheep ranch, riding a horse out in the plains, and it was a beautiful, beautiful experience. And that, to me, is probably the highest joyful moment of our whole trip.
So, what would be for you a typical day during your trip?
Okay, that's hard to do because in a trip like that, every day is different and every day is unexpected. So it's hard to bring something out of that you could call typical. But thinking about it a bit before the interview, I think if you use a base, because we had different bases, like at one point it was the camper van. So we had that for about 4 months. That was our base. And then we were in a house in Greece for a month. That was a base. And then in Australia for a month. That was a base. So if you use those bases, you can extract a typical day. So a typical day in the camper van was, hey, wake up in the morning. Your whole family's there. It's like home. You're all in your sleeping bags and you're warm and you can chat, the 2 kids and the mom and the dad. And mom gets up and starts preparing breakfast. So you have breakfast, you open the curtains, you look outside, it's different, it's beautiful. So that's how the day started. Then usually it was followed, depending on where we were, it was either a road trip or a visiting of a city that we were in. Then we'd come back for lunch at the camper van. Or if we found a place in town that was interesting, we'd have lunch there. Then the afternoon was probably another road trip to get to the next place. And then around supper time, we'd have supper in the camper van. So we sort of established a family routine, which gives you contentment, security, a feeling of home in the run. And then at the end of the day, and this was most of the time, whether it's the van or the houses, at the end of the day, and after supper, we'd sort of get together and chat about what happened that day and where we were going and what was happening. And sometimes we would get at the table and play some game, or Alain and Julie would take the books out because we had brought some school books with them, and they do some reading in the school books, and I couldn't get over how fast they went through those school books. I think of what happens in school where you take a year to go through one volume, and they would go a quarter of the volume in one night, and then, they went through those school books really, really fast because of the interest. So I guess what I'm saying is, what we tried to do is establish a family routine to make the environment more palatable and give us a sense of security. That's typical, as typical as it can get.
And were there a lot of budget restrictions for food and stuff? Like if you would eat out often? Or...
Well, it's funny because when we took off, we thought we had a lot of money because we had the money that we got for a house in our back pockets, and I don't know, it was around $30,000 or something like that, and it seemed like a huge amount of money. We had never seen that much money. But then what happened is that when we hit Europe was the time in history where Europe, the cost of living was going up dramatically, and everything was doubling as we were going along. So at first we had all this money, we were flush, but then as time went on we started noticing, holy shit, $4 for a liter of gas, we were paying massive amounts of money. So then we started being careful, and we started buying a bit in bulk to pay less money, and we try to save. So the question about financing is that it evolved as we went along, but eventually it got very, very tight, even before we were ready to come back home.
So now speaking a bit more towards the end, how do you feel about the German fellow who sent you on a wild goose chase to the other end of the world?
Ah, the German fellow. It's funny because if I look back, I have different feelings about that guy. Like when we first met him, it was a feeling of hope, because we hadn't really considered going all the way to Australia because we were running out of money and it was so far and all that. All of a sudden this guy says, hey, I have a friend there, he can have you at his farm and all that. So there was a ray of hope. Hey, we were going to be able to go to Australia. Isn't that great? So my first reaction to him and my first feeling towards him, oh, isn't he a nice guy? He's giving us a step up, which we need. So that continued until we finally realized, having gotten in Australia, and after a number of phone calls, finally realized that it was a hoax, and that this guy didn't really mean what he said. And here we were stuck in Australia, and we really had nowhere to go. At that point, I guess I hated the guy, if you can hate a guy in absentia. And I quickly put him out of my mind because I didn't like him at all. And then, a while back, after our Australian experience, which was very, very positive, and back home here in Canada and all that, upon reflection, I'm saying, you know what? Maybe that guy was a poor soul, and he hoaxed us, and he gave us false hopes and all that. But guess what? He probably made our year, maybe our lives, by giving us the opportunity to go all the way around the world and meet all those beautiful, beautiful Australian people. We wouldn't have done that if it hadn't been for him.
So he was like a catalyst towards the experience you had in Australia.
Exactly. So in that sense, I have now had very positive feelings toward him. Poor guy, I don't know what happened to him.
So did your overall experiences during the trip change your view of the world?
Of the world, yes, because let's face it, we didn't have a view of the world. Our view of the world was the books that we had learned in school, the books that we had read, the TV programs that we had seen. So our view of the world was very artificial. It was at least third hand and sometimes even more. So we didn't really have a solid and realistic view of the world. So in that sense, it was like, bang, here is the world and you're in it and you're experiencing it. So our view of the world was totally changed. It was made much more realistic. But you know what? In spite of all the surprises and new things and unplanned things that happened, I think the thing that hit me most in the world that was out there is how similar to us they all are. You know? In your readings and TV and all that, you have the impression that they're removed. They're another kind of people and they must live very differently from us. Well, guess what? They're exactly like us. They just have different languages or different colors. But they live every day, like they eat 3 meals a day and they go to the washroom and they have relatives and they have fun and they like to talk and stuff like that. So in that sense, it was really nice to get to know the world because it was so close to our own heart, you know.
That's of an alien feeling from them.
Yeah. All of a sudden the world was familiar.
Hmm.
It was part of us, you know, rather than something removed.
And were you left with any mental or psychological scars as a result of the trip?
Yeah, well, I didn't think I was when I went through it and came back home. But there was one little chink in the armor, I think, because from the time we came back until a couple of years ago, I had a recurring nightmare. Not every night, but quite often. And the recurring nightmare is that I was in a foreign city. I couldn't understand the language. And I knew where I was going, but I kept getting lost getting there. So I never reached it. And I knew that somebody depended on me to get there, like my family. And it was a continual thwarting of my hope and my desire to get to that point. Always the same city. I don't know if it was the same language, it was just a language that I didn't understand. And there were things that I recognized in the city from dream to dream or from nightmare to nightmare. I'd see this street and say, oh, I've been on this street before and I'm nearly there, and then I'd get lost again. So that recurring nightmare, which went on for 20 or more years, I assume was probably a bad psychological effect.
Mm.
So, but apart from that, everything was good.
And how do you think your children were affected by the trip?
Ah, yes. Well, it's funny because, as you may know, my father, when we talked about going away for a year and take the kids out of school, he thought that was horrendous, the worst thing we could do, because nothing could replace a year in school. And guess what? A year out there in the world is worth many, many years in school. I think Alain and Julie quadrupled their perspective, opened their minds, matured, and the maturation part was clear when we came back, because they went and saw their friends that they left behind a year ago, and they'd come back home and say, you know what, I can't relate to them anymore. Like, the stuff they talk about is so silly, you know, and I don't find that I'm the same person that I was a year ago. So that to me said they've changed dramatically, and it was worth many years in school. sorry, Dad.
And especially at that age, I mean, you're such...
They're sponges.
That's when you're building your
Yes.
character. And
Yeah, 10, 11, 12 there. You're over the preliminary ages, and you're starting to establish yourself as a person, and you're a sponge. You take in so much stuff. And they were at the right time, you know.
Mm.
They took all this in, and I think they grew dramatically as a person, each one.
And finally, would you have any advice for someone who would want to do the same as you did?
Yeah, I would. I guess the first thing that I tell them is don't plan it too long or too hard, because you won't go. If you start thinking about all the things that could happen wrong, you say, holy geez, I better stay home, you know, I don't want to risk all that. So don't plan too hard and too long. The second thing I guess I'd say is that one of the most important things that I found, I don't know how the others feel, but what I found is the family unit was our saving grace in many, many occasions. Like, no matter how deep in the trench we were, how bad the situation seemed, we could come together as a family unit and sort of support each other and console each other and all that. So my advice would be to that person, try to make sure that your family unit is solid before you leave. Don't expect that you'll be doing it during the trip, because if it's not there when you leave, it won't be able to help you much during the trip. So that's my second thought. The third thought is very simple. No matter how much money you have in your pocket, you're never going to have enough to do what you think you're going to do out there. Because money is like water in situations like that. It dribbles away and you run out of it much quicker than you thought. And one of the tricks that we used, which I would recommend, is that we had a lot of plastic cards. Like, we had 4 different plastic card companies, like American Express, Visa, and so on. We had 4 of those in our back pocket to save us in case we needed it. And it was a saving point. Like, it allowed us, for instance, to come back from Australia because we had no money. So we took the American Express card and bought ourselves 4 huge tickets to go from Australia to Canada, and that was $4,000 or $5,000 in one shot. So, like I said, plan well and don't count on you having lots of money as being good. You're not going to have enough cash.
And what about leaving your job for such a long time?
Well, I was lucky in a sense because the way my job was going, I was at a point in my career where at the time where we were thinking of leaving, I was going to have just finished a complete project that had been agreed to by the whole department, even by the deputy minister and my boss and everyone else. So it was a clear block of time that I could say, okay, it's behind me, I've got a free time there. And because of what I had done, I could talk to the powers that be and say, look, if I do this, can I get a year off? So I was very fortunate because the timing was perfect. And I'm not sure that everyone would be advantaged by those circumstances as I was. So I guess there was a bit of luck involved there.
All right, well, perfect. I think this concludes the interview.
Good. Thank you very much.